Oak Creek Memorial's fourth-floor ICU hums with fluorescent lights and the rhythmic beep of monitors at 2 a.m. Brooke Sullivan moves through the hallway with practiced efficiency despite the slight drag in her left leg, her navy scrubs already darkened with sweat from a 12-hour shift that's only halfway done. She's 38, lean and unremarkable, the kind of nurse who disappears into the background so completely that most of the day staff wouldn't recognize her in the grocery store. Her dark hair is pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup. No jewelry except a watch with a cracked crystal face. She carries a battered clipboard and moves with the kind of quiet authority that comes from having already survived the worst. 8 months ago, Brooke had arrived at Oak Creek Memorial with a medical discharge paperwork, a limp that would never entirely heal, and a decision to disappear into ordinary life. The shrapnel wound from Bagram had taken 3 surgeries and left her left leg marked with surgical scars that ran from her ankle to mid-thigh like a topographic map of pain. She covered them with compression sleeves under her scrubs, navy over navy, and never once mentioned why she needed them. The other nurses knew her as competent and punctual. That was enough. That was everything. She'd spent 18 years being known for what she could do. Now she just wanted to be known for showing up. She reaches the supply station at the end of the corridor and begins pulling items for the post-op patients in rooms 412 through 416. Saline bags. Alcohol prep pads. Fresh dressing kits. Her hands move through the motions without thought, muscle memory that runs deeper than conscious decision. The same hands that had performed field thoracotomy with a combat knife on a village elder outside Bagram now carefully arranged bandages in neat rows. The same hands that had signed discharge papers marked medically unfit for continued service now adjusted for drip rates at 2:22 a.m. in a hospital 2,000 miles from anywhere that mattered. In her locker downstairs, tucked behind her street clothes, sits a faded military jacket that she touches once before each shift. Just fingers on fabric. Just a moment of remembering who she used to be. The unit patch sewn inside the lining is barely visible anymore, the embroidery worn soft from years of field use, the colors faded to almost invisible. She'd never discussed it with anyone. If anyone had asked about her background, she had her story ready: community college nursing program, regional hospital experience, looking for a fresh start in Norfolk. All of it true, technically. Just not the whole truth. Never the whole truth. The night shift at Oak Creek is quiet, which Brooke prefers. Day shift brings family visitors and chaos and people who want to talk. Night shift brings stability and routine and the kind of silence where you can think. She checks on Colonel Marcus Chen in room 414, the trauma patient admitted 8 hours ago with a compound fracture and internal bleeding from a vehicle collision. He's sedated, stable, his central line placed by Dr. Ashford during the initial resuscitation. Brooke doesn't let her eyes linger on his face even though she recognizes him immediately. She'd seen him once before, in a video call to her son 2 years ago. Her boy's commanding officer. The man who approved his deployment rotation. The man her son had called the best leader he'd ever served under. She doesn't mention recognizing him. She never will. His monitors show steady rhythm, sinus rhythm steady as a drumbeat, oxygen saturation 98%, blood pressure stable at 112/68. She documents everything in the chart with the kind of precision that would satisfy any audit. Professional distance maintained. Every detail recorded. The kind of nursing that leaves no room for questions or assumptions or the kind of liability that comes from letting personal connections influence medical judgment. Dr. Leonard Ashford arrives for his 2:15 a.m. rounds exactly on schedule, his white coat pristine despite the hour, his hair perfectly arranged even after an 8-hour shift. He's the kind of man who seems to have been manufactured for hospital administration, tall, confident, the way he moves through space makes the air pressure change. He's got the kind of jawline that could cut glass and a smile that never reaches his eyes. He's 44, by the chart, but he carries himself like someone who's never experienced actual consequence for anything he's done. Sullivan. He acknowledges her with a slight nod, already moving toward the first patient room. How's the post-op in 412? Stable. Vitals consistent. No complications. She follows him with the chart, keeping 2 steps behind, the required distance of someone who knows their position in the hierarchy. For placement holding. Dressing clean and dry. He enters the room without waiting for her to finish, his eye scanning the equipment with the expression of someone hunting for mistakes. The 4-line Brooke had placed 4 hours ago, a clean 18-gauge angiocath through the basilic vein on the first attempt, textbook insertion, doesn't hold his attention. He moves through the room like he's checking boxes on an inspection list. Adequate. He turns back to her in the doorway. Your technique could use refinement, but it's functional. She doesn't respond. Doesn't argue. Doesn't let her jaw tighten in a way that might be visible to anyone watching. She simply nods and steps back into the hallway, waiting for him to finish with the next room. This is the dance. This is the choreography of being a woman in a hospital hierarchy where the man with the title makes the decisions and the woman with the actual clinical knowledge provides the courtesy of appearing to defer to him. She's done this for years before Bagram. She'll do it for as long as she needs to disappear. Around 2:45 a.m., Brooke notices that Ashford is checking rooms alone, room 413, room 414, room 415, moving between patients without the required witness for controlled substance access. The policy is mandatory. Any access to the narcotic cabinet, any for medication that requires 2 signatures, requires a second staff member present. She knows he knows this. She also knows that nobody ever enforces it against doctors. She pretends not to notice when he unlocks the medication cabinet using his personal key code. She pretends not to see him drawing medication from a syringe, the motion fluid and practiced, someone who's done this exact movement hundreds of times before. She pretends her attention is entirely focused on the vital signs monitor, where Colonel Chen's heart rate sits steady at 72 beats per minute, where his oxygen saturation holds at 97%, where everything appears normal to anyone not paying careful attention. But she is paying careful attention. She's trained her entire career to pay careful attention. At 2:48 a.m., Ashford enters room 414 where Colonel Chen lies sedated. He's alone. He closes the door most of the way, not completely, just enough to establish privacy without making it obvious. Through the gap, Brooke can see him move to the central line site, the 4 access point in Chen's chest that provides direct access to the superior vena cava. She can see him prepare the area with practiced efficiency. She can see him hold an uncapped syringe, uncapped, which means freshly drawn, which means not standard protocol, and inject something directly into the line. 18 seconds. That's how long it takes. 18 seconds from when he enters the room to when he emerges again, his movements casual, his expression neutral. His right hand is in his pocket before he's fully clear of the doorway. His jacket pocket. Brooke watches all of this from her position at the nurse's station, her eyes on the monitor, her face completely neutral, her mind already running calculations. The syringe in his pocket is uncapped. That's either careless or intentional. Either way, it's wrong. The injection into Chen's central line without documentation is wrong. The fact that he did it alone, without a witness, is wrong in ways that go beyond protocol violation. She pulls up Chen's medication record on the computer terminal in front of her. The last documented administration was morphine, 4 milligrams at 1:32 a.m. for postoperative pain management. That entry is signed by both her and another nurse, per protocol. The next entry wouldn't be due for another hour. Whatever Ashford just injected, it's not in the system. Her hands feel steady. Her breathing hasn't changed. Her heart rate is probably still sitting somewhere around 60 beats per minute, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and knowing that panic is a luxury for people with other options. She closes the medication record and returns to her routine, checking monitors, reviewing vitals, making entries in the chart that contains only the information she can verify. If she documents what she saw, it becomes an accusation. If she doesn't document it, it becomes a problem that grows in the dark. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm from room 413. But that wasn't the worst part. The medication discrepancy appeared on the unit board at 6:48 a.m., typed in Ashford's precise handwriting, 3 vials of fentanyl unaccounted for, Sullivan's shift, 2300 to 0700 hours. Brooke read it while standing in the break room doorway with her coffee cooling in her hand. She knew exactly what this was. She also knew it was a lie. The ventilator wheezed from down the hall, a rhythmic, mechanical reminder that her carefully constructed anonymous life had just developed a fracture. The next morning, Ashford called a mandatory unit meeting and positioned himself in front of the whiteboard with the confidence of a man holding all the cards. His voice carried the kind of clinical precision that made it sound reasonable when it was actually a blade. "Sullivan," he said, eyes finding her across the room. "Perhaps you'd like to explain the controlled substance shortage on your shift? Or is record-keeping not taught in whatever community college you attended?" The break room went silent. Heads turned. Ashford smiled, not a real smile, but the expression of a predator recognizing weakness in prey. Brooke set her coffee down on the table with deliberate care. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She'd been trained to move through fire with the same measured composure, and a hospital break room felt almost manageable by comparison. "I documented every medication I administered, Doctor," she said, her voice level as a surgical laser. "The records will show that." She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, not a challenge, just a statement of fact. Ashford's expression shifted slightly. That was interesting. He'd expected her to crumble, to stammer, to apologize for something she hadn't done. Instead, she'd simply stated the truth like someone accustomed to operating in environments where precision mattered. "The records show negligence," he replied, but there was something different in his tone now, a calculation happening behind his eyes. "I'd expect better from someone in your limited position." The break room remained silent. No one stepped forward. No one said they'd witnessed her meticulous charting. They simply looked away. Brooke understood then what was happening. This wasn't just about the fentanyl. This was about Ashford establishing dominance, and everyone in this room had just decided which side of the line they stood on. 2 days later, Ashford orchestrated her final demolition with surgical precision. He arrived during her dressing change on Colonel Chen, the patient she recognized from a photograph David had sent months ago, her own son's commanding officer, a connection she'd kept buried so deep that even breathing near it felt like a violation. Ashford brought Chen's wife and teenage daughter into the room, positioning himself beside the bed like a theater director setting a stage. A teaching moment, he'd called it, but what it actually was felt closer to public execution. Brooke continued her work with Chen's central line dressing, her movements exactly as they always were, gloved hand steady, technique flawless, every step following protocol precisely. Ashford narrated her work like a sports commentator noting every potential failure. "Are you certain that's sterile, Sullivan? Did you actually check the expiration date on that dressing kit? Perhaps we should have a more experienced nurse handle this." Chen's wife shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. His daughter stared at Brooke with the particular intensity of someone witnessing an adult being publicly humiliated. Brooke's face burned, not from shame, but from the effort of containing what wanted to happen next. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Hands that had held comrades together in field hospitals, that had performed emergency cricothyrotomies with equipment that shouldn't have worked, that had tied off bleeding vessels in the dark outside forward operating base shank were now being questioned over a sterile dressing change. She could have said something. Could have turned to Chen's wife and listed her actual qualifications. Could have looked directly at Ashford and let him understand exactly what level of danger he was playing with. Instead, she simply continued her work. Tape. Gauze. Documentation. The invisible armor of professionalism. When she finished, she disposed of the contaminated supplies with the same precision she'd used before, and when Ashford's eyes met hers, expecting something, maybe fear, maybe anger, she offered only a flat, professional nod. "Dressing changed, vitals stable, all documented," she said quietly. "Is there anything else you need, Doctor?" The coldness in her voice was new. She could hear it herself, the way it had shifted down into a lower register, the way it carried the kind of weight that came from having survived things far worse than public humiliation. Ashford's expression flickered with something, recognition, maybe, or the first seed of doubt about what he was actually standing next to. The break room exile began that afternoon. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when she entered. Nurses suddenly remembered urgent tasks elsewhere. The sudden absence of human contact was a different kind of assault than the public criticism, quieter but somehow more complete. She sat alone at lunch for 4 days. Her sandwich grew old on a plastic tray. No one joined her? No one made eye contact. The nickname circulated like a virus. Sullen Sullivan whispered just loudly enough to be heard, just quietly enough that it couldn't officially be addressed. She heard it in the hallway. She heard it in the medication room. She heard it from a resident who laughed when he said it, as if Ashford's narrative was already becoming the room's accepted truth. On the 6th day, Ashford called her into his office. The walls were lined with diplomas and commendations, everything carefully arranged to communicate hierarchy and dominance. His desk was oversized, his chair elevated slightly above the visitor seat, a small architectural manipulation designed to reinforce power dynamics. She stood rather than sat, positioning herself slightly inside the doorway. Ashford smiled at this, at her refusal to fully enter his space, at what he interpreted as submission. "Your reassignment has been approved," he said, sliding a printed transfer document across his mahogany desk. "Pediatric wing, effective immediately. Your last shift in ICU is Friday. 2 hours away from David's base. Pediatrics, where she'd be managing ear infections and dehydration instead of fighting for patient lives. A complete evisceration of her professional placement, accomplished through institutional machinery, technically legal, undeniably calculated." Brooke looked at the transfer papers without touching them. Then she looked at Ashford. "You should know I don't forget faces, Doctor," she said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. It was only 8 words, but they carried something in them that made his expression shift from satisfaction to something closer to concern. She delivered them in a tone that suggested she'd said similar things in very different contexts, to people in very different circumstances, and those people had understood what the words actually meant. She turned to leave before he could respond, and that's when she felt it, the single tear that escaped her eye as she reached the doorway. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let him see it for exactly 2 seconds, let him believe that she was broken, that his strategy had worked, that she was just another nurse whose career he'd dismantled. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand without breaking her stride, and as she walked down the corridor toward the stairwell, her jaw clenched into a line like welded steel. Behind her, she heard Ashford reach for his phone. She didn't slow down. She didn't look back. The call he made reached HR before she'd descended 2 flights of stairs. By afternoon, her access badge had been deactivated for the entire ICU floor. She understood what this meant immediately. She couldn't enter Colonel Chen's room, couldn't monitor his care, couldn't see what Ashford was doing with him during the hours when supervision was minimal. That night, sitting in her car in the parking garage with the engine running, she made a decision that would define the next 72 hours. She was going to document everything. She couldn't access the patient rooms directly anymore, but she could observe. She could watch. She could bear witness to whatever was happening on that floor, even if bearing witness meant standing in the stairwell with her phone, photographing a man who had just dismantled her career through institutional channels he controlled completely. He made a phone call before she'd reached the elevator. The receiver had barely touched the cradle when Brooke stepped into the hallway outside his office, and she heard his voice drop into that particular register, the one that sounded like a tank idling in a garage, all controlled power and zero negotiation. She didn't turn around. Didn't pause. Just kept walking toward the elevator bank with her hand steady at her sides, her jaw set at an angle that would have looked like calm to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But her body knew. Her body remembered what it felt like to be marked. By the next morning, HR had already flagged her file. The conversation happened at 9:33 a.m. in a windowless conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Rebecca Chen from Human Resources slid a transfer packet across the table. Satellite clinic, 2 hours south toward the Virginia border, same pay, same benefits, different life. It's a lateral move, Rebecca said, not meeting her eyes. Very routine. The staffing needs at the South Side location are acute, and Dr. Ashford mentioned you might benefit from a change of pace. Less ICU pressure. More predictable patient loads. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she pushed the paperwork forward. She knew. Everyone knew. The hospital had 1,000 invisible channels, and the message had already traveled through all of them. The competent nurse had become the problem nurse, and problems got transferred. Brooke read through the packet without speaking. Transfer effective in 7 business days. Notification to be posted on the unit board by end of shift. New orientation begins Monday 6 a.m. She signed everything with a pen that Rebecca provided, her signature exactly the same as it had been 8 months ago when she arrived at Oak Creek, clean block letters, no flourish, the signature of someone who didn't expect to be remembered. The shrapnel scar on her left forearm caught the fluorescent light as she signed the last page. Rebecca's eyes followed it for a fraction of a second before looking away. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Rebecca asked, and her voice carried the kind of careful sympathy that only comes when someone is deeply uncomfortable. "No," Brooke said. She slid the pen back across the table. "Thank you for the opportunity." That was a Tuesday. The transfer would become effective on the following Monday. 7 days to tie up loose ends, say nothing, and disappear into a routine that would allow her to keep the lie alive. 7 days to continue charting vitals and running fours as if her reputation hadn't just been systematically dismantled by a man who was terrified of what she'd seen. 7 days to keep her son from knowing that everything he believed about his mother's new civilian life had been constructed on the foundation of professional humiliation. For days before that scheduled transfer, a Friday evening, 6:44 p.m., Brooke sat in her car in the parking garage at Oak Creek Memorial, parked in a spot on the 4th level where nobody ever went. The Subaru's engine was dead. Had been dead for 20 minutes. Her forehead was pressed against the steering wheel, and she couldn't make her hands reach for the ignition. The air inside the car had grown thick with the smell of stale coffee and the ghost of antiseptic that lived in her clothes. Outside, the Norfolk evening was transitioning into darkness, that particular shade of blue-gray that happened in late autumn when the light gave up before 6 o'clock. A few cars moved past her on the level, brake lights flaring, people heading home or to the ER or to whatever their evening required. None of them looked at the Subaru. None of them saw the woman with her forehead pressed to the wheel, shoulders locked tight enough that breathing had become a conscious decision. She thought about the field thoracotomy. She always thought about the field thoracotomy when the weight became too much to hold. Sanjin Valley, Helm and Province, May 2019. A convoy ambush that wasn't supposed to happen because intelligence said the valley was clear. She'd been attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a Dark Horse, as the senior medical officer, 34 years old and steady in a way that came from having already survived 3 tours. The IED had hit the second Humvee at approximately 1,447 hours. 3 soldiers, one of them with massive hemorrhaging from a chest wound that had already soaked through 2 pressure dressings, lungs filling with blood, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. The medevac bird was 12 minutes out. He had 90 seconds, maybe less. She'd opened his chest with the tools she had, a combat knife from her aid bag, hands moving through the motions her training had burned into her muscle memory like a second language. Fingers finding the right ribs, the knife slicing through tissue, blood and air, and the terrible knowledge that if she hesitated for even a moment, this man would die in the dust while his brothers watched. But her hands hadn't shaken then. Not once. She'd clamped the descending thoracic aorta with her bare hands, fingers closing around the vessel that fed the lower body, cutting off the hemorrhage while her team ran 2 wide bore lines and pushed whole blood directly into his veins. The helicopter arrived at 9 minutes. He'd lived. All 3 of them had lived. Her hands were shaking now. She could see them trembling against the steering wheel, and she couldn't make them stop. These were the hands that had held lives together in the worst conditions the world could manufacture, and they were shaking because a doctor at a civilian hospital had decided she was a threat and used the machinery of institutional power to erase her. Because she'd been silenced. Because she couldn't protect Colonel Chen without revealing who she was. Because her son was somewhere in Norfolk thinking his mother was a nurse with a clean employment record, and the truth was so far from that it had its own time zone. The fluorescent lights of the parking garage hummed their particular mechanical song, a sound that never stopped, a sound that had become the background of her life. She could hear her own breathing, ragged at the edges, and the distant sound of a vehicle starting on another level. The air smelled like concrete and oil and the lingering ghost of diesel exhaust. Her phone sat on a passenger seat, screen dark, waiting for a message that wouldn't come. She'd checked her email at 6:32 p.m. Still nothing from the satellite clinic. Just the transfer papers, just the schedule change, just the systematic removal of her from the place where she'd started to believe that starting over might be possible. Her son would call soon, he always called on Friday nights, and she would tell him that work was fine, that the new assignment was a good opportunity, that she was handling everything with the competent flexibility of someone who was exactly what she pretended to be. A nurse. Just a nurse. At 6:52 p.m., her phone screen lit up like a warning flare. Alert, active shooter 4th floor ICU, all personnel evacuate immediately, code silver, code silver, code silver. The notification came through 3 times in succession, each one screaming at her with the particular urgency of the hospital's emergency system. Outside her car, everything changed. Footsteps. Running. Voices climbing an octave into panic. The sound of people moving fast, the kind of fast that only happens when the primitive brain recognizes predator, and the only response is flight. Brooke's forehead came up off the steering wheel. The trembling in her hand stopped. Her training arrived the way it always did, not as a conscious decision but as a complete and total reorganization of every system in her body. Time stretched and compressed simultaneously. The fear didn't disappear, it simply found a new channel, redirecting itself into tactical awareness. The dark parking garage, the exits, the elevator shaft she could hear over the sound of other people running. The 4th floor ICU was where Colonel Marcus Chen lay in a bed that was supposed to be protected. Where her son's commanding officer was completely vulnerable to whatever was happening upstairs. She didn't think. Thinking was for people who had time. Her hands found the door handle and pulled. The parking garage air hit her lungs like a slap, cold, carrying the iron taste of impending winter and the acrid smell of burning rubber from tires that had accelerated too fast. People were flowing past her car toward the exits, down the ramps, toward the street, toward safety. They were running the right direction. Every civilian instinct said the same thing: down, out, away, survive. Brooke turned toward the stairwell. Her left leg screamed in protest as she moved toward the door-marked stairs with the faded green emergency sign. The shrapnel had settled into the joint over the 8 months of civilian work, and she'd learned to move around it, favoring her right side, compensating with her core. But this was different. This was the kind of movement that came from muscle memory that didn't care about old wounds. Her hand found the stairwell door and pulled. The industrial hinge groaned. The sound of boots on concrete, her boots, military tread learned in training that the civilian world had never quite erased from her movement patterns, echoed up the stairwell shaft. 4th floor. For flights. Her thigh burned, shrapnel pain like something alive under the skin, and she took the stairs 2 at a time anyway because time was the only currency that mattered and she had none of it. By the time she pushed open the door at the 4th floor landing, her breathing had locked into the controlled rhythm of someone whose body had been trained for exactly this. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Everything else quiet. Everything else secondary. The hallway was chaos, chairs overturned, a tray of medication cups scattered across the floor near the nursing station, the footstand knocked sideways with the bag hanging at a wrong angle, dripping onto the tile. And 20 feet away, a man who was easily 6'5", maybe 250 pounds, dressed in tactical gear that hung wrong on his frame the way it does when someone has lost weight quickly. His rifle was raised at chest height, and he was screaming for a name. Ashford. Dr. Leonard Ashford. I know you're here. I know what you did. The patients' families who had been in the visitation chairs near Colonel Chen's room were scattered behind overturned furniture, pressed against the walls, some of them crying, some of them frozen in that particular paralysis that comes when the body refuses to believe the eyes. Security hadn't arrived yet. The response time from the emergency call would be somewhere between 3 and 4 minutes depending on where they were stationed. The man with the rifle was here now. Brooke stepped out of the stairwell and into the hallway where everyone else had chosen to hide. She sat in her car in the parking garage, engine dead, forehead pressed to the steering wheel. For days she'd been sitting here. For days of not moving, not thinking, just breathing in the stale air of failed second chances. The code silver alert crackled through her phone at 3:08 p.m. Active shooter. 4th floor ICU. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. Brooke ran toward the stairwell while everyone else poured past her going down. Nurses. Visitors. Security. A tide of bodies moving away from danger, and she was moving into it, taking the stairs 2 at a time, her bad leg screaming. Pain was information. Pain was a map. She'd learned that in Bagram when shrapnel had rewritten her femur into something that would never quite work right again. Now it worked fine. Adrenaline was its own anesthetic. The 4th floor hallway was chaos holding its breath. She burst through the stairwell door and saw him immediately. 6'5". 250, maybe more. Tactical gear. Rifle raised. Eyes wide with the look of someone who'd already decided to die today but wanted to take someone with him. He was screaming for Ashford. Over and over, voice hoarse and desperate, "Where is he? Where is he? Where is he?" Patients' families crouched behind overturned chairs. A cart lay on its side, for bags scattered across the tile like fallen leaves. An elderly woman was pressed against the wall, hand over her mouth. The gunman moved through the hallway with the unsteady gait of someone running on pure rage, and Brooke understood immediately, he wasn't here to kill randomly. He was here for Ashford. This was personal. She stepped into the hallway with her hands visible at shoulder height, palms forward, fingers spread. Not a threat. Not a weapon. Just a person. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her, indifferent to everything happening below them. She let her voice drop, not quieter, but lower, into the register she'd used outside Bagram when the insurgents had her platoon pinned and screaming. The register of someone who'd already accepted death and could therefore speak to it directly. I'm a nurse. I'm unarmed. And whatever Ashford did to you, shooting through me won't fix it. The rifle swung toward her chest. She saw his finger move to the trigger guard, not the trigger itself, which meant training, which meant he'd been military once, which meant he was still military in the parts that mattered. His hands were shaking. The kind of trembling that came from holding something too heavy for too long. She kept walking. 20 feet became 15. His breathing came in short, ragged bursts. The gun barrel wavered. She was close enough now to see the faded ink on his forearms, the marks of someone who'd lived through things that left permanent impressions. Close enough to see the tear in his jacket lining and the patch visible through it. 3rd Battalion. Special Forces. Operation Granite Shield. The same unit. The same operation. 10 feet away now, and she said it quietly, like she was telling him a secret the whole hallway needed to hear. Bagram. 2019, Operation Granite Shield. You were Major Reed's platoon. His eyes went wide. The rifle barrel dropped 6 inches. I remember you, she said. Not a question. Not a guess. A statement of fact delivered by someone who'd been there, who'd bled there, who'd left pieces of herself in that desert and come home knowing she'd never be whole again. You can't, his voice cracked like a teenager's. She reached out with 2 fingers and pushed the rifle barrel toward the floor. Not yanked it. Not fought for it. Simply guided it down the way you'd guide a frightened child away from a cliff edge. I was there. I'm Major Sullivan. You're safe now. Whatever he did, we'll fix it. The rifle clattered to the tile. The sound echoed down the hallway like a prayer answered. She guided him to his knees, not through force, but through the absolute authority of someone who'd taught soldiers how to kneel and how to stand again. His breathing slowed. His shoulders caved inward. Security thundered up the stairwell behind them, boots pounding like a heartbeat made of rage. And then the supply closet door opened. Dr. Ashford emerged from where he'd been hiding, already moving toward security, already pointing. Arrest her. Now. She interfered with hospital protocol and endangered everyone in this building. His voice had that sharp edge of someone who realized the world had just shifted and was trying to keep his footing. She approached an armed suspect without authorization. She could have gotten people killed. Security hesitated. They looked at the gunman on his knees, at Brooke standing over him with her hand on his shoulder, at Ashford with his phone already in his other hand. Ashford was already dialing. Not hospital administration. Someone else. Someone with cameras. By 8 p.m., a local news crew was setting up lights in the hospital lobby. Ashford stood in his white coat with the fluorescent light making him look like a saint on a prayer card, explaining to the reporter how a staff member with absolutely no security training had taken matters into her own hands and put everyone at risk. "We're grateful no one was hurt," he said, voice modulated to concern. "But this is exactly why protocols exist. This is why trained personnel respond to crises, not," he paused, searching for the word, "volunteers." The reporter wrote it down. The camera caught Ashford's expression perfectly, concerned, professional, the kind of doctor who cared so much about his hospital that he had to report the dangerous actions of others. By 9 p.m., the story was already seeding through the news cycle. Nurse risks lives with reckless intervention. Doctor warns of protocol violations. At 9:15 p.m., Administrator Marion Voss called an emergency meeting in the conference room on the third floor. She'd pulled Brooke's personnel file, and her hands were trembling as she turned the pages. Dr. Ashford sat across from Brooke with his arms crossed, already preparing his closing argument for why she needed to be terminated immediately. 3 board members flanked Voss. 2 security chiefs sat in the corner, uncomfortable with what was about to happen but ready to enforce it. Voss was reading the same line over and over on the background check page. Security clearance, classified. Do not contact previous employer without Department of Defense authorization. Her voice came out small, major. That's irrelevant, Ashford said quickly, sensing the question mark in that word. Her security clearance status doesn't change the fact that she... The conference room door opened. A young army captain in dress uniform stood in the doorway. Not a lawyer. Not an advocate. Just a young officer in his dress blues with his jaw set and his eyes on Brooke. "You mean Major Sullivan," he said, and the room went perfectly still. Every head turned toward the doorway. "I'm Captain David Sullivan. That's my mother." Ashford's face did something complicated. He looked between David and Brooke saw the moment he understood he'd made a catastrophic error. Not a small mistake. Not a miscalculation he could walk back. A fundamental misreading of the person sitting across from him. David stepped into the room. Major Brooke Sullivan, United States Army Special Forces. 23 years of active service. Medically retired at the rank of major following service-connected disability. He pulled an official military document from an envelope and placed it on the table. She's entitled to every protection under the Uniformed Services Employment and Re-employment Rights Act. And that's before we get to the actual qualifications she has for what just happened upstairs. A Navy SEAL in civilian clothes appeared in the doorway behind David, right arm in a sling, the kind of sling that meant serious shoulder reconstruction and months of physical therapy. He stepped forward with the deliberate movements of someone in constant pain who'd learned to move anyway. "Major Sullivan earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart," he said, voice like gravel and steel. "She carried me half a click with a fractured spine under enemy fire outside Bagram in 2019. When our medic went down, she performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife. Saved 3 men that day. Including me. Ashford's face had gone the color of old hospital walls. The SEAL continued, her call sign was Valkyrie. Because when you were going to die anyway, she was the last thing you'd see before you started living again. He looked directly at Ashford. The man upstairs on the 4th floor? Colonel Marcus Chen? He was her commanding officer. She was protecting one of her own. David pulled out his phone and projected an image on the conference room screen. Brooke in desert camouflage, covered in dust and blood, carrying a wounded soldier. Shrapnel had torn through her leg, you could see the bandaging even in the photograph, but she was still moving, still supporting the weight, still getting her man to safety. Operation Granite Shield, David said quietly. 2019, this is what happens when you try to destroy someone who's already survived worse than anything you can do to her. Brooke sat with her hands folded in her lap, breathing steady, meeting no one's eyes. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The room erupted in whispered chaos. Voss looked at the photograph, then at Brooke, then back at the photograph. One board member actually stood up from his chair. Ashford's mouth moved but no sound came out. Dr. Ashford emerged from a supply closet 3 feet to Brooke's left, his white coat still buttoned, his hands shaking. Before anyone could move, he pointed directly at her with the trembling finger of a man drowning. That woman, he said, his voice cracking like thin ice, violated every protocol we have. She interfered with hospital security. She endangered this entire facility. The administrator's pen froze mid-sentence. The SEAL team leader crossed his arms. Brooke stood motionless, her breathing steady, her hands at her sides exactly where they'd been a moment before. I'm calling for her immediate arrest, Ashford continued, the pitch of his voice climbing higher with each word. Reckless. Incompetent. A nurse with a savior complex who decided she knew better than trained security personnel. He was speaking faster now, the words tumbling out like debris from a collapsing structure. And before anyone believes whatever story she's constructed here, I want it on record that I have already contacted the local news. Multiple outlets. I've explained exactly what happened, how an untrained civilian interfered with an active threat response, how she put lives at risk through her own arrogance. The conference room door swung inward. Brooke's son stood in the threshold, still in his SEAL team dress blues, the fabric catching the fluorescent light like polished steel. He looked directly at the administrator. You mean Major Sullivan, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with the precision of a blade through silk. His uniform seemed to change the air pressure in the room. The administrator's hands began to tremble more visibly. The administrator slowly opened Brooke's personnel file again. Her fingers traced down the page to the section marked Background Security Clearance, and there it was, a classification flag she'd somehow missed during the initial hiring process. Flagged. Verified. Classified. 12 years of active service before the medical discharge. The documents detailed everything: authorized access to classified military medical protocols, operational security clearance level secret, renewal dates extending 3 years beyond her civilian employment start date. She was. The administrator began, then stopped. The Navy SEAL stepped forward. He was a compact man, built like a fire hydrant filled with concrete, his face weathered by sun and sand and things that didn't have names in polite conversation. Major Sullivan earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart extracting my team under fire, he said, his voice steady as a surgical laser. She carried me half a click, that's half a kilometer, with a fractured spine. I couldn't walk. She wouldn't leave me. He paused, letting that weight settle. That was 2019. Sanjin Valley. She saved more lives than some entire medical school's graduate in a year. The conference room door opened again. An FBI agent in a charcoal suit entered, accompanied by 2 Norfolk police detectives whose badges caught the overhead light. The agent was a woman in her 50s, her movements economical, her expression suggesting she'd seen men like Ashford before and knew exactly how this would end. Dr. Leonard Ashford, she said, not as a question. I want a lawyer, Ashford said immediately, his hand already reaching for his phone. You can have one, the agent said with the tone of someone reading instructions from a manual she'd long since memorized. First, we need to discuss your relationship with the individual currently in custody, former Sergeant Michael Torres. He was being blackmailed with stolen medical records documenting a PTSD diagnosis from his deployment. You've been selling fraudulent opioid prescriptions to a distribution network, using patient records to identify and coerce vulnerable veterans. The agent pulled a folder from her bag. It was thick. Colonel Chen witnessed you accessing controlled substances without authorization 3 months ago. He reported it to hospital administration, but administration dismissed his concerns. Ashford's face had gone the color of old newspaper. You transferred Major Sullivan away from Colonel Chen's care specifically to prevent her from cross-referencing what she'd witnessed, the agent continued. Her medical expertise made her a risk. Your colleagues had already begun distancing themselves from you, but you didn't know that. You were still working within assumptions of institutional loyalty that stopped applying the moment you committed fraud. The pieces of the timeline locked together across the room like a mechanism finally finding alignment. Brooks' sudden write-ups appeared on the same day Chen arrived. Her public humiliation had accelerated after Chen's initial report. Her transfer had removed her from the one place in the hospital where she could have documented what she'd seen. Ashford had moved against her with surgical precision, not understanding that he was moving against someone who had performed field thoracotomies with a combat knife, who had taught junior officers how to function when everything was breaking simultaneously, who had been trained to notice exactly what he was doing because noticing was survival. "I'm calling my attorney," Ashford announced, standing abruptly and knocking his chair backward. It clattered against the tile floor like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. "This is absurd. And regardless of whatever classification this woman claims." His phone began vibrating. Once. Twice. 3 times in rapid succession. He looked at the screen. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again without producing sound. While Ashford had been in the emergency meeting with the hospital administrator and the SEAL and Brooks' son, while he'd been making his threats and demanding arrests, he'd called the local news to go live on the evening broadcast. He'd done it from his office, had explained in clear, righteous tones how an untrained civilian nurse with a hero complex had endangered the entire hospital by interfering with active security protocols. He'd been eloquent about protocol. He'd been passionate about proper procedure. He'd been a physician defending his institution. 12 minutes into his appearance, a Pentagon liaison had called into the broadcast. The liaison had spoken to 6 million viewers across the Norfolk region. 6 million people watching their evening news. The liaison had calmly detailed the fraud investigation into Dr. Leonard Ashford spanning 3 years. The liaison had mentioned 17 identified victims, all veterans, all blackmailed with their own medical records, all coerced into illegal prescription purchases to maintain their PTSD diagnosis secret. The liaison had stated the amount discovered in illegal transactions, $340,000. Then the liaison had spoken about Major Sullivan. 2 Bronze Stars. 12 years of active service. 3 deployments to combat zones. The extraction of a Navy SEAL team from hostile fire while sustaining a compound fracture of the femur that should have ended her mobility permanently. The fact that she had, minutes earlier, walked directly toward an armed and unstable veteran instead of running, had used her military authority and her knowledge of shared trauma to de-escalate a situation that could have resulted in multiple casualties. The liaison had paused deliberately, a media technique designed to let information settle, and then stated that Major Sullivan had likely saved multiple lives today through her intervention, and that her intervention was only possible because Dr. Ashford had been blackmailing that same veteran with his stolen medical records. The news station was running a split screen now. On the left side, the broadcast played footage of Ashford's earlier condemnation, his righteous face, his accusations, his demands for the untrained nurse to be prosecuted. On the right side, it displayed Major Sullivan's decorated service record. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Commendation medals listing dates and locations. Photographs of her in uniform, her face harder than, her eyes carrying the particular weight of someone who had seen the worst that humans could inflict and had refused to break. Ashford's phone continued vibrating. Messages from colleagues. Messages from the hospital board. Messages from news outlets requesting comment. One from the state medical board requesting his immediate presence for an emergency disciplinary hearing. One from his attorney, whom he hadn't even called yet, informing him that the Bar Association was aware of the situation and that his license was being reviewed. The FBI agent placed a hand on Ashford's shoulder. It was a gesture designed to look gentle in case anyone was watching, but the grip suggested immovable force. "We'll need you to come with us," she said. The two Norfolk detectives moved into position on either side of him like an honor guard for a funeral. As they guided him toward the door, Ashford tried one final gambit, his voice cracking across the accusation like ice fracturing beneath sudden weight. "I'm a respected physician," he said to no one, to everyone. "This is character assassination. You can't just..." No one in the conference room met his eyes as he passed through the doorway and into the hallway where police vehicles were already waiting, their red and blue lights strobing against the hospital's exterior walls. The administrator sat down very slowly. 6 months later, Brooke walked past a strip mall in downtown Norfolk on a Tuesday afternoon. She was on her way to a meeting at the Veterans Affairs Regional Office, where she'd been promoted to Director of Veterans Care Services, a position that hadn't existed before, that had been created specifically for someone with her combination of medical expertise, military background, and demonstrated ability to function under pressure that would liquefy most people's nerve systems. Through the window of a vacant storefront, she saw Dr. Leonard Ashford. He was sitting at a folding table beneath a hand-painted banner reading auto insurance quotes. His shirt was rumpled, short-sleeved, the collar stained in a way that suggested the laundromat had learned his name. No white coat. No stethoscope. No institutional authority. He was explaining coverage options to an elderly woman whose confused expression suggested she'd wandered in because it was air-conditioned, not because she'd made a conscious decision to discuss deductibles. His medical license had been revoked for months earlier. The fraud investigation had expanded beyond what anyone initially understood. 17 identified victims. 17 veterans whose medical records had been stolen and weaponized. 17 people who'd come forward once they understood they weren't alone, that what had been done to them was systematic rather than personal. The civil suits were still pending. The criminal investigation was ongoing. The amount discovered in illegal transactions had grown to $412,000 when they'd finally finished auditing his offshore accounts. He looked up. His eyes found hers through the plate glass window. For a moment, they held. The moment stretched like honey poured from height. Brooke didn't break stride. She allowed herself a single smile, not triumphant, not cruel, just acknowledgement. The recognition of a calculation completed. A reckoning that had moved through systems and consequences and had arrived at exactly the place it needed to be. Inside her professional bag was a folder containing the new veteran crisis protocol she was implementing across all Norfolk hospitals. A system designed to catch exactly what Ashford had been doing, to flag unauthorized access to controlled substances, to create redundancy so that one person couldn't weaponize vulnerability. Colonel Chen had recovered fully and had recommended her for a civilian service medal. Her son, David, had transferred to Oak Creek's partner base specifically to be closer to her. The gunman, former Sergeant Michael Torres, was receiving treatment at a VA facility she personally helped arrange, his charges significantly reduced due to the evidence of blackmail and coercion. The nurses who'd exiled her in the break room now requested her shifts, learning her crisis protocols, understanding finally what they'd been too blind to see. She walked on, and the late afternoon sun was warm on her face, and in her locker at Oak Creek Memorial, a jacket still hung on a hook, the faded unit patch from her Special Forces days sewn carefully into the lining, visible now to anyone who looked, hidden no longer. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what you would have done in Major Sullivan's position. Like this video and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story of quiet strength and earned recognition.